Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome one and all to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month we extend happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee, from a 20th all the way up to a 100th anniversary. This, as ever, is your devoted host, Eric Martin, creator of the Cineverse blog and moderator of the weekly Cineverse Film Discussion Group. If you have just found our show, welcome. If you're a regular listener, we are thrilled you've returned. Yep, it's that time of year again, when the jack-o'-lanterns glow, the wind whistles through the trees, and scary content dominates our TV and movie screens. It's the perfect time to pay tribute to cinematic horror, and this month we're going to do exactly that, times two. We'll be honoring a pair of all-time great horror films, one that still ranks as the most frightening movie ever made, and the second that remains debatably the finest in the horror comedy subgenre. So first up, we'll focus on The Exorcist, marking a 50th anniversary in 2023 by speaking with Alexander Philippe, director of Leap of Faith, William Friedkin on The Exorcist, and a fantastic filmmaker who last joined us in episode number 28 3 years ago. That's when we commemorated the 60th anniversary of Psycho. Now, immediately after my conversation with Alexander, we'll shift into Universal Classic Monster mode as we send happy birthday wishes to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, originally released 75 years ago, and we chat with classic horror film historian and author Gregory Mank. You might remember he was last on Cineversary a year ago to discuss Cat People with me. Together, me and my guests will investigate what makes The Exorcist so terrifying half a century later, and how Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein so finely straddles that line between funny and frightful, as well as why these two pictures still matter, ways they were influential, and much, much more. Okay, as you could probably imagine, there's a lot to unpack in this supersized bag of an episode, so let's get started. We need a bit of background to better appreciate the first film in our double feature, so let's turn to Wikipedia for some backstory necessaries on The Exorcist. The Exorcist is a 1973 American supernatural horror film directed by William Friedkin from a screenplay by William Peter Blatty based on his 1971 novel of the same name. The movie stars Ellen Burstyn, Max von Sydow, Jason Miller, and Linda Blair. The story follows the demonic possession of a young girl and her mother's attempt to rescue her through an exorcism by two Catholic priests. Blatty, who also produced the film, and Friedkin, his choice as director, had difficulty casting The Exorcist. Their choice of relative unknowns in Burstyn, Blair, and Miller, instead of choosing major stars, drew opposition from Warner Brothers. Principal photography was also difficult, taking place in both hot deserts and refrigerated sets. Many cast and crew were injured, some died, and unusual accidents delayed shooting. Production took twice as long as scheduled and cost almost 3 times the initial budget. The many mishaps have led to a belief that the film was cursed. The Exorcist was released in 24 theaters in the United States on December 26, 1973. Reviews were mixed, but audiences waited in long lines during cold weather. The sold-out shows were even more profitable for Warner Brothers, since they had booked it into those theaters under 4-wall distribution rental agreements, which was the first time a major studio had done that. Some viewers suffered adverse physical reactions, fainting or vomiting to shocking scenes such as realistic cerebral angiography. Many children were allowed to see it, leading to charges that the MPAA ratings board had accommodated Warner Brothers by giving the film an R rating instead of an X rating to ensure the troubled production and its commercial success. Several cities attempted to ban The Exorcist outright or prevent children from attending. At the end of its original theatrical run, the film grossed $193 million and to date has a lifetime gross of $441 million, with subsequent re-releases included. The cultural conversation around The Exorcist helped it become the first horror film to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture, as well as 9 other Oscars. Blatty ended up winning for Best Adapted Screenplay, while the sound engineers took the Oscar for Best Sound. The Exorcist has had several sequels and was the highest-grossing R-rated horror film, unadjusted for inflation, until the film It hit theaters in 2017. The Exorcist had a significant influence on pop culture, and several publications regard it as one of the greatest horror films ever made. In 2010, the Library of Congress selected the film for preservation in the United States National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. A sequel, set 50 years later, called The Exorcist Believer, was released this year on October 6th, with Burstein and Blair reprising their roles. A quick visit to Rotten Tomatoes reveals that The Exorcist earns a more than respectable 78% fresh score and an average 8.4 out of 10 rating from critics. Its Metascore at Metacritic.com is an impressive 82, and on the American Film Institute's list of the top 100 most exciting films ever, The Exorcist places number 3 behind Psycho and Jaws. All right, buckle your seatbelt, grab onto something tight, and take a thrill ride with me as we listen to the original trailer for The Exorcist.
Somewhere between science and superstition, there is another world. The world of darkness. Nobody expected it.
Let's see what
Nobody believed it. And nothing could stop it.
There are no experts. You probably know as much about possession as most priests. Look, your daughter doesn't say she's a demon. She says she's the devil himself.
I'm telling you that thing upstairs isn't my daughter. Now, I want you to tell me that you know for a fact that there's nothing wrong with my daughter except in her mind. You tell me you know for a fact that an exorcism wouldn't do any good. You tell me that!
The one hope. The only hope. The Exorcist.
We've come to that point in the show where it's my duty to remind you that key plot points will be revealed in the interview that follows. So take my advice, whether you've never laid eyes on it before or it's been many a full moon since your last viewing, take a breather, go watch The Exorcist, and reconvene with us at this point you left off. And if my words don't motivate you to do so, maybe a couple men of the cloth will.
The power of Christ compels you! The power of Christ compels you!
And the curtain rises for our first guest. Returning to the Cineversary microphone is filmmaker Alexander Philippe, director of several highly acclaimed documentaries, including Leap of Faith, William Friedkin on The Exorcist, 7852, which dissects the shower scene in Psycho, and most recently, Lynch Oz, which explores David Lynch's obsession with the Wizard of Oz in his films. Alexander, welcome back to Cineversary.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you back here to talk about the 50th anniversary of The Exorcist. So every October, we always devote a spotlight on a horror classic, and horror classics don't come much better than this, sir. Boy, it's hard to believe it's been 50 years since this film hit theaters. Let's go back in time here. When was the first time you viewed The Exorcist? Do you remember how old you were, and what was your initial reaction?
Yeah, I actually took me a while to watch it because my mom had told me stories of, watching it in the theater and not being able to sleep for a week and having to keep all the lights on. And so, as a kid, I was watching horror movies from a very young age, but, my first memories of The Exorcist was essentially hearing horror stories about the film from my mother, and therefore kind of delaying. I was obviously very curious about it because I loved the horror genre, as a kid, but I really delayed it as much as I possibly could. And so I think, I don't exactly remember how old I was, but I would like to say that I was probably around 20, I think, when I watched it. I think it was on VHS.
So what was your reaction? Yeah, what like did it live up to the hype that your mother had kind of painted in your mind?
Well, it's interesting because to me, I mean, of course, The Exorcist is a horror movie, but I think the horror components of the film are not necessarily what make it such a great film. And so it's complicated because to me, it's a movie that really moves me deeply more than it scares me.
Okay.
I think it's a heartbreaking tragedy before it is a scary film.
Interesting.
So I certainly didn't have the same reaction. It to me, it's not the kind of film, I started getting nightmares, or at least not on the first watch. When I was preparing for Leap of Faith and watched the film every single day for 30 days, by day 15 I started to get some pretty intense nightmares.
I'll bet.
I mean, that's a different story, but no, it moved me and it shook me. It had a deep emotional effect, left a big impact, but I definitely did not have the same experience as my mom.
Wow. Well, thanks for relating those experiences. For my part, my history with this film is quite turbulent because I first screened it as a 14-year-old, I remember, and it definitely proceeded to give me nightmares for decades afterward, which I think is a testament to its effectiveness, of course. And convinced that I was also going to end up possessed, Alexander, I absolutely refused to rewatch The Exorcist until I was about 50 years old, right? So my 22-year-old and my 13-year-old sons, they basically shamed me into finally revisiting the film with them. They're like, come on, Dad, you need to get over your fears. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't until about 4 years ago that I dared to set eyes on this movie again. And what a revelation it was, because not only did I realize how well crafted and paced and acted this film is, but the rewatch, it kind of exorcised any recurrence of haunted dreams. So that, the nightmares have pretty much evaporated. And now I can pull this title off the shelf and give it a whirl without thinking twice. So I'm grateful to my sons for helping me kind of conquer my phobia about The Exorcist.
That's great.
So why and how does this film remain one of the all-time great horror movies? What is it about The Exorcist that is worthy of celebration 50 years later?
Well, I mean, I think it's it's one of the all-time great horror movies, but it's also one of the all-time great movies, period. Doesn't really matter what genre you're talking about. It's a film about love. It's a film about grief. It's a film about guilt. It's a film about very powerful human emotions. This idea of a mother losing her child to something that she does not understand. I mean, you can apply so many ideas to that, and you can replace the mother with a husband or a wife. You can, or a friend, or, like so many people, this idea of losing someone to something that is unexplainable, that you can't do anything about, I think that's what's, really deeply tragic about this, and sort of that narrative arc, the Chris's narrative arc, I think is really deeply engaging.
Sure.
But, Father Karras, I think also is extraordinarily important and well developed as a character. I mean, the guilt that he feels, towards, his mother, overcoming the grief, helping out this little girl who technically he's never met. I mean, when he meets Regan for the first time, she's already been possessed by Pazuzu, so he never gets to meet her as Regan. We do. And, we get to see what a wonderful, bright and cheerful, full of life and passion for life little girl she is. But he never gets to see that, and yet he commits the ultimate sacrifice. He sacrifices himself for her.
Yes.
So you want to talk about sort of character arcs and emotions and deeply felt ideas. I mean, this film really has it all.
I completely second everything you said, but I would go a little further in my own estimation of the film, and revisiting it and kind of reading up more about it and kind of reappraising and appreciating The Exorcist all anew. It's fascinating, some of the things you learn about it, right? I'm sure when you interviewed William and did your own homework for your documentary, a lot of these things were fresh on your mind. But for my part, this film deserves praise for its authenticity, the high production values and the quality craftsmanship, because those are three kind of, adjectives that don't really apply to horror much before The Exorcist, with a few exceptions. The phenomenal special effects, they're not schlocky for 1973. They're not budget constrained. The outstanding makeup work by Dick Smith and the carefully orchestrated practical effects for everything from the rotating head and the levitated body to the simulated projectile vomiting, they look and feel realistic, right?
Sure.
While Friedkin, he's criticized in retrospect, his tactics may have been somewhat abusive, selfish, maybe extreme. He pushed his cast and crew really hard to achieve these horrific visuals and to lend the film a verisimilitude that places The Exorcist, in my opinion, many notches higher than standard horror fare for this era. It also helps that he and William Blatty, they imbue the picture with authentic details, basing the narrative on a true account of exorcism. I think it was from 1949, and consulting with religious experts to accurately depict the exorcism rite. Placing his actors within, for example, a refrigerated bedroom to produce visible breath vapor. That's going the extra mile, right?
Yep.
Taking advice from medical experts to make the hospital testing scenes so unnerving, yet also faithful to what was involved with an actual angiography procedure at that time. So the collaborators, they deserve kudos for giving The Exorcist an utterly plausible sheen of realism by paying attention to those fine details and making Reagan's physical transformation so disturbingly graphic. Much of what makes this film so great is that it wasn't afraid to push the envelope, Alexander, to risk extreme controversy, right? Because audiences, they'd never before seen this kind of demonic possession so convincingly portrayed, or a young female character so graphically vulgar or sexually expressive in this horrific context. And you add in the blasphemous and profane words that the character utters, the grotesque physical manifestations of the demon inhabiting her body, the brief but completely upsetting subliminal images like the flashes of the face of Pazuzu that you can maybe make out with your conscious mind, but definitely your subconscious, and the gross out hospital testing sequences, and all of those things combined, you've got a potently distressing film whose content consistently upsets audiences. And that creates this kind of perfect formula for word-of-mouth buzz in 1973 and high ticket demand. So this became this overnight sensation kind of a film. And no one had ever seen a movie like this before. It was causing viewers to faint, to vomit, to suffer miscarriage, to believe they were possessed, to seek medical and psychiatric care, to flee theaters in abject terror. You'd never heard of anything like this before. So this movie was so alarming, in fact, that it was banned in the UK and some other countries. It received negative reviews from several prominent critics at the time, although many others gave it positive notices. But yeah, so just that phenomenon that The Exorcist became is quite incredible to think about that. All these years later, decades later, we're not waiting around the block in super long lines for movies anymore. So it's really hard to appreciate maybe younger generations like how big of a phenomenon this was.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's all true, but I think Friedkin, clearly was an envelope pusher. Thinking about his insistence to go to Iraq, to film the opening sequence, which is very much a sort of tone and mood setter and not so much a narrative opening. That's talk about a risk. I think that's a major risk, as well.
Yeah, the studio was trying to tell him to cut that out. Even some of his peers are like, you don't even need that stuff, but it absolutely sets the table. You're right.
Yeah, but he really stuck to his guns on every level. But I agree, of course, about the sort of the authenticity of the film on a lot of levels. He did tell me privately that if he were to make the film now, or more recently, he would have cut back a lot on the special effects.
Interesting. Okay.
Which I think is an interesting thing. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to not even talk about the special effects during, the 6 days of interviews that I did with him on The Exorcist. Well, first of all, they've been well documented and they've been talked about. But and I really don't mean this as as disrespect, because I think they are revolutionary. I think they are extraordinary. I think they are authentic. But my take on The Exorcist is very different. I would even go as far as to say I think they're the least interesting aspect of The Exorcist.
Wow.
When he talks about the film, you really hear someone who thinks about the little subtle moments, the moments of humanity, what he calls the grace notes, referring back to Citizen Kane. it's the small things, I think, that matter to him.
Yeah, because I remember in your documentary, he pointed to the scene between Kinderman meeting in the kitchen of Chris as his favorite scene in the movie. And
That's right.
you wouldn't necessarily predict that that would be the director's favorite scene, but looking back on it, revisiting the movie recently, it is so well acted and kind of choreographed that makes sense. It's a very important dramatic moment, but in the major plot and as far as things people remember most about The Exorcist, it's minute, relatively speaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that if you ask 100 people, what do you think William Friedkin's, favorite scene in The Exorcist, was, without having, watched Leap of Faith, I'm fairly confident that 100 out of 100 would pick a different scene.
Maybe the Exorcist scene itself with Marin and Karras in the last 26 minutes. When you do recaps of The Exorcist, or you see it on award shows, or they do a horror retrospective, those are the kind of shots and images you see.
Yeah.
That's what people remember for. And I'm not saying that's the wrong choice, because I absolutely do think that those are crucial scenes. And again, most people regard this as a straight up horror film. Yeah. But to your point, and I agree to a large extent, it's more than just a horror film. And that's why, maybe that's part of the resonance of The Exorcist and why it deserves to be celebrated 50 years later, because it transcends simple horror.
It's a fine line. I also want to be very clear that I'm not trying to poo-poo horror. Obviously, horror, the horror genre is probably the most important genre to me. Most of the films that I make are about horror. I'm actually working on a 50th anniversary film for Texas Chainsaw Massacre right now.
Oh, fantastic. Wow.
Yeah, so,
okay. Maybe we got a little exclusive.
So there's horror is extremely important, I think as a genre. But I think that's true of every film, that I think every great film, whether you're talking about horror or romantic comedy or drama or Western or whatever, every great film really transcends the tropes. It transcends its own genre, because it really becomes this sort of really unique thing. It's a unique narrative. It's a unique artifact. It resonates with culture for many different reasons. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we can absolutely celebrate The Exorcist as 100% a great horror film, but we can and we should celebrate The Exorcist as a great film, period.
Absolutely. But, just kind of latching onto that point there, I think The Exorcist is not a simplistic exploitation film.
Yeah.
Going for the lowest common denominator. It's not going for gore or easy jump scares or cheap shocks.
Of course.
The supernatural elements are front and center in the second half. We can certainly agree. But it also explores psychological horror elements by examining the personal torments and the inner turmoil of this poor mother, terrified mother, desperate to help her child. And also, as you said, Karras, a priest experiencing a crisis of faith and guilt about his dead mother. Arguably, this story is much more about Karras than any other character.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I agree.
And we could talk about that when we get to themes in just a little bit. But just to kind of round out a few other corners here on The Exorcist before we move on to another facet I'd like to ask you about, we have to talk briefly about the sound design, because it just proved exceptional. I mean, in this recent rewatch, I just paid much more attention to. There were so many abrupt, loud, percussive noises meant to startle us. And I don't necessarily think they were meant as pure jump scares, but you have the din in the attic, the horse cart in Iraq, the unexpected ringing of the telephone, the noisy medical equipment, as well as, of course, the fantastic amalgamation created to conjure up the demonic voice, which includes, the haunting words by the gravelly-voiced Mercedes McCambridge actress, mixed with animal noises, mixed with electronic sound distortions. And this is one of the 2 Oscars that the film won. And it's well-deserved.
Yeah.
It's just an amazing sound field here.
Yeah.
But it's also, Alexander, it's this slow burn, right? It's this film that demands great patience from you, because for many people, it's the word of mouth of, oh, you got to see this movie. It's going to blow your mind. It's going to give you nightmares. It's going to scare you. So you're eagerly awaiting the scares. And really, the possession doesn't kick in until about 40 minutes in. The famous exorcism sequence arrives in the final 26 minutes. And for that matter, you think about, there are several key actions that occur off screen, preventing the viewer from seeing, for example, the killing of Burke, the death of Karras' mother, Marin's demise, for example. I want to read you something here. This is by Slant magazine critic Wes Green, who said that the film prefers, quote, tone and theme over story. The horror is mostly dictated through its masterful atmosphere and ellipses, which carefully eliminates exposition and character detail to subconsciously put the viewer in a state of unease and preparing us for the overt frights that occur later on.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that it's a lot more complex than this. Because while I agree that tone and mood are really crucial, and I think I absolutely agree with this idea. I mean, what I love is the ellipses. The fact that there's a lot that happens off screen. As you said, and I think that your imagination goes, and as we all know, especially in horror, right? When you can imagine something, when you can hear something just off screen, happening, but you don't see it, it becomes that much more powerful. The fact that we don't see Kim Novak's fall at the end of Vertigo. What exactly happens there? I mean, that's still really essentially up for debate. But I don't think that's to the detriment of story. I mean, I think we really need to make the distinction here because one of the things that Friedkin was very adamant about is, and I agree with him 100% on why this film was so powerful and remains so powerful, is because it was a simple story well told. The storytelling is absolutely exquisite from beginning to end. And, the thing is, and I think which is what's so remarkable about it, is that the book obviously is a simple story well told and powerfully told. And when Blatty wrote the first draft of the screenplay, Friedkin rejected it because he felt that Blatty had actually gone astray. He had taken too many liberties against his own sort of original work. And so he brought it back to a version that was essentially closer to the book as a cinematic version of it. But so to me, it's all of the above. I don't think it's tone and mood to the detriment of story. I think it's tone and mood in support of a great and powerful story well told.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Before we move on, I mean, I was going to mention the outstanding performances here. And it garnered nominations for acting as well by both actresses Ellen Burstyn and Linda Blair. But it's Blair in particular, to me, who I think is so overshadowed often in retrospects or talk about the movie. You have a 12-year-old actress here who had to endure extreme physical and psychological discomfort to inhabit this role. And to me, I don't care if a lot of the performance is assisted by Mercedes McCambridge or the special effects. You still have a 12-year-old girl who has to pull off and make us believe that she is possessed. And it's absolutely incredible. She deserves so much more credit than she typically gets. And that's not at the detriment of anyone else in the film, because, boy, is this a well-cast movie. You have
unbelievable.
Max von Sydow. This is an actor who distinguished himself years earlier as this stellar thespian for Ingmar Bergman, often playing faith-challenged characters. So the casting is spot on there. Lee J. Cobb as Kinderman. It's almost an embarrassment of riches that you have fifth or sixth in the casting. You have Lee J. Cobb and Mercedes McCambridge herself, who was an Oscar winner as the unholy voice of Pazuzu. I guess it's low-hanging fruit, but the truth is this is a finely acted film.
Oh, I mean, it's impeccably acted film. I mean, as you said, you from the major roles all the way down to the smaller roles, and it's absolute perfection. And when you think about what Friedkin had to do, to convince some of the actors, and there's a lot of serendipity, a lot of, for lack of a better term, leap of faith, really, from Friedkin. I think he himself, you could make the argument that he was sort of, in a good way, possessed by this story, in the sense that I think he was in a zone of knowing exactly what to do to make it work, and made it work, in a brilliant way.
Right.
Again, the insistence to cast certain actors, the insistence to go to Iraq, rejecting the score from Bernard Herrmann, and going through needle drop after needle drop after needle drop until he found the tracks that he wanted to use. I mean, you can really go down the list of all the risks that he took. I mean, he was obviously a maverick filmmaker, but I think this is a maverick filmmaker operating at the top of his form.
You're so right. I want to take just another moment here to talk about what Friedkin brings to the film and why he was the ideal director for such a project.
Sure.
We both know that he often pushed his actors and his crew to extreme lengths to achieve this vision. He slapped one actor, for example, to elicit an alarmed reaction just before turning on the camera, I read. For key scenes, he fired gunshot blanks in the air to unsettle these thespians. And, both Burstyn and Blair were injured during the filming of some violent scenes, so they really suffered for their art here. But he deserves applause as well for allowing himself to be inspired by earlier artists. Your documentary fleshes this out. Painters like Rembrandt and Monet and Magritte, and even fellow filmmakers like Sidney Lumet and Hélène Régnier, who each had films that also effectively utilized subliminal images, as well as the master of suspense himself, Alfred Hitchcock. Now, I counted at least 2 shots from Psycho that Friedkin borrows and kind of replicates in The Exorcist.
Yeah.
I also paid attention on this recent revisit to how Friedkin employs a slow zoom in or zoom out on characters or objects in The Exorcist to produce a disconcerting visual effect. And this style was copied somewhat in 2 subsequent classics I thought of immediately after watching The Exorcist: The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Alien, both from the 1970s. Now, there are many other examples of Friedkin's wise directorial choices and attuned sensibilities that make him perhaps the perfect director for The Exorcist, but I at least wanted to touch on these points. So I want to pivot briefly here and talk about ways that The Exorcist was influential, innovative, or perhaps the first of its kind. So all of the things we've already talked about, especially, the sound design, we're going to talk maybe a little bit more about the music, casting some relative unknowns in the top parts and things of that nature. They coalesce to make The Exorcist a groundbreaking picture. A major point for me, at least being a co-lover, as you are, of the horror genre, is that this film adds legitimacy to the genre, and it clears the path for other prestige horror films to come that benefited from things like bigger budgets, acclaimed filmmakers attached to them, and more extensive marketing. You think of Jaws in the 2 years after The Exorcist, and then The Omen comes, and Carrie, and then Alien, and these are just in the 70s. So it's no small feat that The Exorcist, as we were saying, it won 2 Academy Awards as well, after getting 10 nominations. And also, I'm sure you're aware, this is the first horror film ever nominated for a Best Picture Academy Award. That means it's only one of 6 movies in this genre to earn that distinction.
Yeah.
The Exorcist is one of only 19 horror films to date to have won an Oscar in any category. So often the horror genre is the bastard stepchild of the Oscars and the elite and the people who write the critiques and so forth. But this is definitely a cut above. The Exorcist proved that horror movies could be incredibly frightening, but also artistically constructed and well-made, and should be taken more seriously as an art form and a work of entertainment.
I'm always really sad that, still today, we unfortunately have to have this conversation about the legitimacy of horror when it's always been one of the most important genres.
Certainly.
I mean, going back to fairy tales that have been passed on from generation to generation over centuries, horror is an essential rite of passage for us as humans. If you look deep into the history of movies, there's a very strong argument to be made that many of the greatest films ever made are horror movies. And, going all the way back to the silent days, So why is it that, the genre is still seeking legitimacy? I don't know. But we're still, we're still there. Why is it that The Exorcist became the first horror film to be nominated for Best Picture is baffling. But, at the end of the day, to me, it's obviously it's not about the awards. It's about the impact that those films are having. And I think that impact is very clear.
Yeah, no question. So speaking of the impact, the box office triumph that was The Exorcist, it prompted Warner Brothers to greenlight a sequel, and that was a rarity for the horror genre at this time. Now, the first sequel, Exorcist II: The Heretic, is not the greatest movie in the world, but it actually spawned 3 sequels, and there's a prequel. It did give rise to a short-lived TV series and innumerable imitators, Alexander, right? I mean, we have to talk briefly about all the copycats in the wake of The Exorcist. So just to kind of name drop a few, some better, some worse, in the years that followed The Exorcist, consider that we have things like Abbott, Beyond the Door, Satan, the Antichrist, the House of Exorcism, the Sentinel, the Manitou, the Amityville Horror. And more recent examples include things like The Exorcism of Emily Rose, The Last Exorcism, The Rite, The Devil Inside, The Possession, The Conjuring 2, Deliver Us from Evil, The Devil's Doorway. The list goes on and on. So that speaks to the lasting legacy of The Exorcist, certainly. The sheer number of films within the possession horror subgenre. Yeah. And The Exorcist's extremely graphic scenes depicting things like mutilation and vomiting, urination, bloody self-harm, they likely inspired future films in the body horror subgenre. Maybe folks like Cronenberg took a cue from The Exorcist, for example. But it also proved that you don't necessarily need a traditional score to musically punctuate a horror film, because the choice to add atmospheric music, Mike Oldfield's song Tubular Bells, I think was a really inspired one.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, I mean, but of course, Hitchcock had done that with Hitchcock and Herman with the Birds. Also, I mean, it's you don't have a score, and so
That's right.
talk about unnerving.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, I think anything successful is always going to spawn a bunch of copycats, and some of them better than others. But I think the ones that I think are successful or remain successful are the ones that really always go back to, how do we make a great film? How do we take the tropes from a certain genre but do something new with it for a specific reason?
Sure.
How do we tell a great story? How do we make a film that is going to have an impact, as opposed to let's just ape or imitate, which so many of those films actually do, and that's diminishing returns.
No question. As far as the score, I was going to say too, that's a good call on the Birds. It's often forgotten. When you watch the Birds and you think about that film, you don't think about a proper score, but there is one. It's just that it's more of a tonal kind of a piece, if you will. It's an untraditional score. And you have a similar approach here. Aside from the use of the song Tubular Bells, which he repeats a few times in the film, you have music from this avant-garde Polish composer. I hope I don't butcher his name, but Krzysztof Penderecki. Yeah, and so you've got these unsettling tones, these loud chords and sound clusters, and non-melodic instrumentation to evoke this really frightening mood. And it doesn't sound like traditional music. So if you want to go buy the soundtrack, it's not going to stay in your head like this toe-tapping tune or something. And then you think about The Shining, just a few years later, takes a cue from this musical choice of Friedkin, and uses this same composer, Kubrick did. And then countless horror films in the decades since The Exorcist, Alexander, they've copied this approach to discordant, disquieting musical accompaniment.
Yeah.
So that's yet another way in which The Exorcist was innovative.
Yeah, well, Friedkin talked about it as a sound museum, and I think there's a lot of truth there. I mean, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre very much feels like a sound museum. I mean, there's so much experimentation.
You're so right
there. But you think about a young filmmaker. Granted, he was an Oscar-winning director at the time already, but wanting to work with his hero Bernard Herrmann, who was set on an organ score and recording that in a church. Think about the vision that Friedkin had to say, you know what? No, I'm going to walk away from that and from you. I mean, he walked away from his hero. A lesser filmmaker would have thought in this particular case, well, Bernard Herrmann knows best. As 99% of the time, that would be true. But I think in this case, you project the idea of an organ-only score over The Exorcist, and I think 100% Friedkin did the right thing.
Agreed.
As difficult as it must have been as a young, still young director at the time, to walk away from Bernard Herrmann. I mean, think about
that. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, I know we're getting short on time. We'd have to talk a bit about themes or subtexts or messages, for that matter. What can be extracted from The Exorcist? So what do you take away as far as maybe some thematic content here?
At the risk of sort of repeating myself or going back to it, I mean, I keep going back to love. I mean, there's something profoundly existential, this idea of, as Friedkin says in my film, we live alone, we die alone. There's a real sense of loneliness. There's this incredible moment when, the dream sequence when Karras is waving to his mother and they're separated, and she's coming out of the subway and they're waving at each other and they're separated, and you feel like there's literally a continent separating them. And it's a heartbreaking image. But I think, guilt and grief and personal sacrifice, grace, one of the many, many, many things that is so incredibly powerful about The Exorcist is that it really doesn't matter whether you're a person of faith or not.
Okay.
Whether you're a Christian, whether you're agnostic, atheist, it is still a film that will speak to most people, again, because it is a profoundly human film, because it is a film that addresses themes and ideas and emotions that, quite frankly, if you're a human, if you've got blood running through your veins, that you have experienced, that you're going to experience, that you have been thinking about. That is the greatness of The Exorcist. And I think that's one of the reasons why people flock to theaters and continue to, on re-releases and remain so powerful. It's a film that speaks to us as humans.
I like what you said there about how it can resonate even if you're not religious. That being said, though, and I'm not a very religious person. I was raised Catholic, but I'm not a practicing Catholic. I am not an atheist, but I'm an open-minded person. My beliefs have evolved. My thinking has changed. But this movie still speaks to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm not equating it to a work of fantasy, but just like, let's say, a fantasy film. Mm-hmm. You can have supernatural elements. You can have deities in a fantasy film. You can still subscribe to what the characters believe in. And so even if you're not religious, I would contend that this movie can still pull you in because of the essential conflicts going on that you may not personally believe in. So a lot of people will point to the timeless conflict of good versus evil in this movie and faith versus doubt. So what Regan suffers, it can't be explained or cured by science or psychology in this story, right? This film purports that truly evil and demonic forces exist that can be supernaturally embodied within us against our will, even within the form of an innocent young girl. That's not to say that you personally believe that can happen, that demonic possession is real and that can happen in the real world. Maybe you don't. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, you can suspend your disbelief for long enough, for 2 hours, and really get pulled into this story. I love in the director's cut, there are some choices Friedkin makes that I like and others that I don't like, but I love when Karras essentially asks, why her?
Why this girl? It makes no sense.
I think that the point is to make us despair. To see ourselves as animal and ugly. To reject the possibility that God could love us.
This ties into the whole theme of, this is more Karras' story and his story of selflessness and sacrifice. This is a man suffering a crisis of spiritual faith. He's racked with guilt, as you said, over his mother's suffering and her death. Yeah. He has to summon inner strength and conviction to battle this demon, especially after Marin dies. He walks in that room, and what is he going to do now? The right has failed, or it's at least been thwarted. Mm-hmm. And he must take matters into his own hands. He has to attempt to pull the demon out of Regan and into himself. Now, Pazuzu helps matters by doing what? By yanking the medallion of St. Christopher off of Karras' neck. And if you look it up, St. Christopher is the patron saint of safe travel and overcoming adversity and summoning courage. So that medallion gone, that enables the entity to possess the priest, if you buy into that, theology. Karras then throws himself from the window to prevent full possession and protect Regan, but he's going to die in the process. So again, it's really about Karras, that sacrifice and that selflessness.
Oh, completely. I mean, I think he becomes the main character, not the central character. I think the central character is Regan. That ending is particularly interesting because, as you know, William Friedkin struggled and still struggles with that sequence that he feels millions of people understand and take for granted, but he's not quite sure he completely understands what happens himself, which I think it's such a beautiful sort of moment, for a director, especially one like William Friedkin, to express that. Mm-hmm. But I think it works. I mean, I think for me, it's a moment that I think it is an act of self-sacrifice.
And love, yes.
And love, mm-hmm. Absolutely an act of love. And I think that's what makes it so beautiful.
Yeah, and transcends the typical horror fare, if you will. All right, a couple of other themes I think are worthy of our time and attention. One of them is symbiosis and the intersecting of disparate lives. Gradually, Alexander, the film brings together 4 key characters who kind of seem drawn together by fate to me. Marin, Karras, Chris/Regan, and to a lesser extent, Kinderman. Yeah. Bad omens, foreshadowing elements, premonitions, they all proliferate through the first 2 acts. For example, Marin's unsettling experiences in Iraq and the sudden stopping of a clock that suggests his ticker will eventually expire too. There's the framed photo of Reagan clasping her hands in a prayer-like pose, and the declining health of Karis's mother. We recall her convalescing in a mental hospital amid patients who look possessed. And then there's the falling St. Christopher medallion in Karis's dream that later becomes reality. By the final act, all these prime characters, they're coalescing, right? They're coming together inside Chris's home, and the ultimate battle between good and evil, that's when that transpires.
Mm-hmm.
And a final message to chew on is that conservative values matter in The Exorcist, because this film suggests that age-old forces of good and evil are at work shaping the world, and that science, technology, secularism, they're no match for belief in a higher power. It's no surprise that Friedkin described this as a film, quote, about the mystery of faith, and he says it right up front in your documentary.
Yeah.
For Karras to defeat Pazuzu and save Reagan, his faith in God and belief in the existence and power of the devil had to be restored. So think about this further. Because Chris is a liberal-minded, divorced single mother working in the Hollywood system who proves powerless against this demonic possession of her daughter, the message perhaps, at least for those who subscribe to this disputed theory, is that feminism lacks agency. Children need a traditional family paradigm with a more dedicated mom, and that's why it takes two patriarchal priestly figures to rescue Reagan and restore her body, her soul, and her innocence. I'm going to read to you here a quote from film reviewer Richard Scheib, who said that The Exorcist seems to imply that innocence is a natural state of childhood, and that for children to be obscene, use sexual references, masturbate, even to pee on the carpet is something evil. In other words, it is behaviorally alien to them, therefore it must come from the devil. It is a type of thinking that sits atop the mood of conservative parental thinking of the 1970s, that of parents suddenly unable to understand how come their children were no longer innocent and cherubic and were instead dropping out of society, taking drugs, having sex before marriage, and rioting against established authority. The 1960s youth revolt was something so far removed from some traditional parents' views that children should be good and innocent, and that the temptation to see the devil as the cause must have been strong. Unquote.
Mm-hmm.
This is the 50th birthday of The Exorcist. Birthdays are a time for giving presents, only it's the fans who continue to receive the gifts when a beloved film marks a milestone year. So, Alexander, what is The Exorcist's greatest gift to viewers?
I think especially now, in light of what happened recently, there's only one thing that comes to mind for me, and it's the greatest gift is William Friedkin. I've been really quite shaken by his passing. I spoke to him a few months ago, the last time. I didn't know it was going to be the last time. He was very excited about having finished his new film. I didn't imagine that I wouldn't see him again. I've had the gift really of spending a lot of time with him, but beyond the 6 days of interviews, it's the numerous phone conversations and coffees and lunches, and I've really come to sort of see him and appreciate him, not just as a mentor, but as a wonderful human. He was the most intelligent and learned man that I had ever met. I mean, there's not a single topic that he couldn't discuss in great depth with a lot of humility and intelligence.
Hear, hear. Did you ever listen to his audio commentary for Vertigo?
No.
It totally speaks to his intelligence. He's so articulate, so well-versed,
Yeah.
and you could tell he knows so much about so many different artistic things in particular.
Yeah, but he was just really a gift, to all of us. And, beyond The Exorcist, I mean, obviously his body of work will live on. I mean, you think about even movies like Killer Joe or Bug, which are movies that if you don't know who directed them and you're watching them, you're like, this is a director who's like 30 years old. There's so much energy and so much passion and so much risk-taking. You can hardly believe that someone at the time his 70s would be, pulling off a film like this. And you go down the list. I mean, obviously Sorcerer, obviously The French Connection. I mean, it's really extraordinary. So yeah, so he was a gift. I really miss him. But he lives on through the films. He lives on certainly through The Exorcist. And for me personally, I feel just really blessed that I was able to capture him, as, I think the person he wanted to be shown as in Leap of Faith. And hopefully that'll stay true for, future generations.
Yeah, I think you did a fantastic job of doing exactly that, because that documentary of yours is such a great reflection of the director and his tastes and his talents and so forth. But again, the way you structure the documentary and have him talk about things beyond The Exorcist, right, is really so telling and valuable to the viewer. So hats off to you.
Thank you.
And I'm so glad you had a chance to forge a relationship with William Friedkin. And we, of course, have that great documentary to savor now in his passing.
Yeah.
All right, for thinking about the greatest gift of The Exorcist, yeah, it comes down to this for me. The film, it may not be as traumatizing or radical as it was on first release. You know, that was a time when Americans' faith in their country, its leaders, the future, it was shaken by the Vietnam War and Watergate and the sexual revolution and this growing sociocultural pessimism. But I firmly believe The Exorcist still has plenty of venom in its sharp fangs, and I expect that it continues to serve as an alarming sensory and psychological experience for so many different types of watchers. If you're a parent, for instance, this tale is your worst nightmare. If you are a teenager, you put yourself in Reagan's position and maybe you worry that you're a candidate for possession, as I did for a while as an adolescent. Perhaps most vulnerable to its spiritual scares are religious types, who can find affirmation of their faith in a higher power after screening The Exorcist, while on the other hand, secular viewers and lapsed Christians could end up asking themselves, what if, and maybe shuddering at the inexplicable. Older fans, they can find inspiration in the tried and tested Marin, yet to be horrified by the reality that age eventually catches up with us. And if the devil doesn't get you, a heart attack just might.
Yep.
So what's my overarching point? Well, The Exorcist's greatest gift could be that it's an equal opportunity terrifier, a film with a deserved shock reputation that precedes every rewatch and reminds you that for the past 50 years, this has been regarded by the masses and the media as the most frightening film of them all.
Oh, yeah.
It is no surprise to me that Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb, Time Out, AMC, Vudu, Study Finds, Meerkat Movies, and other sources, pollsters, and publishers have ranked The Exorcist #1 on their lists of the scariest films ever made. The ability to terrify so many generations after half a century, yeah, that's one hell of a superpower. So, are there any current or forthcoming films, projects, events, or appearances that our audience would like to know about? You teased about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre documentary. When can we expect that?
Yeah, well, that one we're in production. It will be. We're looking at premiering it in the fall of 2024, because that'll be the 50th anniversary of the original theatrical release of the film.
Perfect.
But I also, I'm touring right now with the film on William Shatner that premiered at South by Southwest back in March, and heading off to, BFI London next week, and Sitges and Ghent. We have a lot of festivals coming up, and that one is also a very sort of intimate, very different, but very intimate, up close and personal portrait of William Shatner at 92 years of age. It's called You Can Call Me Belle. It premiered in March, and very, very proud of it. It's also a very emotional. It's not the film about William Shatner that you think it might be. Quite the contrary. But it's also very much. It's a one-on-one. It has similarities to Leap of Faith, but it's also very, very different.
I can't wait to check it out.
Yeah, so that'll be coming out, I think, probably early next year. We're still trying to figure out theatrical release, and probably be touring a few cities with Bill himself, and we'll bring that to the fans.
Well, Alexander, there's lots of great things to look forward to on your plate. And boy, I just want to express my immense gratitude that you took the time to revisit The Exorcist here. This is such a treat to talk to you.
No, my pleasure.
So happy Halloween season.
You too.
And keep up the great work with the films.
Thank you so much. And hopefully I'll talk to you again for Texas Chainsaw.
I'd love that, sir. I think we've got a teaser on our own here. I had
There you
something
go.
to look forward to a year from now.
All right, sounds good.
Best of luck.
Take care.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Oh, what a privilege it was speaking again with Alexander Philippe, a big fan of our show and a gifted filmmaker who is so passionate about genius works of horror like The Exorcist. A big tip of the cap to him for making time to talk with me during what was a very busy schedule for him. Alexander, thanks again. We swing now from a stressful, scary film to a fun, silly, yet still seasonally atmospheric picture that remains beloved by so many fans of vintage horror. We are, of course, talking about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And to set the proper milieu for this monster magnum opus, we look again to Wikipedia. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is an American horror comedy film directed by Charles Barton that was initially released on June 15, 1948. The film features Count Dracula, played by Bela Lugosi, who has become partners with Dr. Chandra Mornay, the actress Lenore Aubert, as Dracula requires a simple, pliable brain to reactivate Frankenstein's monster, this time played by Glenn Strange. Dracula discovers that the ideal brain actually belongs to Wilbur Gray, now that's Lou Costello here, who is wooed by Mornay to the operating table, despite the warnings of Lawrence Talbot, with Lon Chaney Jr. in that role. Now, going back a bit, on November 28, 1945, Universal Pictures joined with British entrepreneur J. Arthur Rank, who bought 1/4 interest in the studio. In 1946, Universal reported a profit of only $4.6 million. They responded by dropping many actors from their contract roster, including Chaney. On July 31, 1946, an official merger began. The company was now called Universal International, and they only had Deanna Durbin, Maria Montez, Bud Abbott, and Lou Costello, and a few other actors remaining on their payroll. Now, since the February 1941 release of Buck Private, starring Abbott and Costello, the duo were among the most powerful stars at Universal. By 1945, they nearly split up, however, as they were fighting each other and suffered from their own personal issues. If you didn't know, Abbott suffered from severe epilepsy, and Costello had nearly died of rheumatic heart disease in 1943. In their first year of operation, the studio nearly went bankrupt. In 1948, William Getz had been in charge of production since Universal merged with International Pictures. In that same year, Abbott and Costello's popularity was also waning. According to director Charles Barton, who was among the top comedy film directors at the studio between 1945 and 1952, Getz didn't want anything to do with Abbott and Costello after Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer had dropped their option for more films from the team, and after Camel Cigarettes dropped their radio show in 1947. Robert Arthur, a former writer and associate producer of MGM musicals, along with veteran Abbott and Costello writers Frederick Rinaldo and Robert Lees, developed a script that involved Frankenstein's monster, Count Dracula, and the Wolfman. Their original script also included Karis the Mummy, Dracula's son, Count Alucard, and the Invisible Man. This script was further developed and production began against the wishes of Abbott and Costello, with the latter specifically not liking the script. Yet, on the film's release, it was one of Universal International's biggest hits of the year and led to several follow-up movies involving Abbott and Costello meeting other horror film actors and creatures. The movie was well received by many trade papers and critics on its release, and in 2001, the United States Library of Congress deemed this movie culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant and selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein later placed at number 56 on the list of the American Film Institute's 100 Funniest American Movies. The picture captures a 90% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes today, where its average critical score is 7.1 out of 10. Climb aboard with me now on the laugh locomotive that is the re-release trailer for this flick.
Count Dracula sleeps in this coffin, but rises every night at sunset. Chick is right. This is awful silly stuff.
Come on, take it all out.
Now! Look out, Chick! Cover up!
What's the matter?
Cover up!
Wait a minute.
The nation's top comics, Abbott and Costello. Petrified, but hilariously. Plus the dangerous and terrifying Wolfman, played by Lon Chaney. Plus that fiend out of a nightmare, the vampire Batman, Count Dracula, played by Bela Lugosi. Plus the most dreaded creature of them all, the Frankenstein monster, played by Glenn Strange. Plus a couple of luscious but designing females in the spookiest laugh fest on record.
Let's now give a warm welcome to our returning champion of Halloween time, Gregory Mink. We had the pleasure of visiting with him 1 year ago for our episode spotlighting Val Lewton's Cat People, and we're excited to have him back. He's the author of several books like The Very Witching Time of Night, Dark Alleys of Classic Horror Cinema, and It's Alive, the classic cinema saga of Frankenstein. He's also a 2-time Rondo Award winner for Writer of the Year, a Monster Kid Hall of Famer, and the voice of many commentaries found on DVD and Blu-ray editions of classic horror films, including this month's co-feature, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. It's Gregory Make. So wonderful to speak with you again, Greg.
Thank you, Eric. It's great to be with you, too. Happy Halloween.
Yes, happy Halloween season, sir. It's my favorite time of year and a wonderful time to discuss some classic horror. And you don't get much more classic than Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and it's the 75th anniversary year.
It sure is.
Refresh me. Do you recall the actual release date? I just didn't look it up. I'm curious. I think it was released in the summer of 48. Was that correct?
Actually, it was the summer of 48. That's right. And of course, they took it out in the summer because of the fact that there would be so many kids, out there going to the movies. And so that was a big part of its appeal, was the fact that it was a great summertime, feel-good movie of the summer.
It became one of the top 10 box office champions of 48.
It sure did. And it was, I think, a surprise to everybody. I don't think anybody was more surprised than Lou Costello. Lou Costello, thought the movie was going to be a dog. And, he had no clue that this was going to probably become their most, popular all-time film.
Yeah.
And certainly it contains maybe his most energetic performance. He was working hard all the way through it to try to make it appealing and try to make it funny because he thought it was all going to fall on his face. And sure enough, it became this incredible hit. And then when it did, he didn't want to hear it. Everybody was saying, "Boy, what a big hit you have!" And having told me, Frankenstein, no.
Wasn't having any of that, huh? Even though it's probably remains their most beloved, cherished work among their fans and classic horror fans as well.
I think so.
Yeah. So let's dive a little deeper here. I want to ask you, when was the first time, if you can recall, that you viewed this film? What age do you think you were, and what impression did it make on you?
Well, it was funny because of the fact that I was probably about 11 or 12, on about the 7th grade, I imagine. And then one of the reasons I remembered very well is because I went out playing with my little brother in the snow that afternoon, and he was about 6. We came in the house to warm up and turn on the television, and the movie was just starting. We had no idea it was going to be on.
You mean to say that it wasn't a planned sit-down watch? You just kind of turned the TV on
and it was not.
On?
It was fate had it that way. We just came in, sat down, and there it was. We thought, wow. And I was somewhat familiar with the horror films at that point because some years before, Shock Theater had come to Baltimore,
right?
And where we lived, and so I was able to sit up with my parents, my dad particularly, on Saturday nights, and I saw the Frankenstein monster and the Wolfman, Dracula, and knew who they all were, and what terrible things they did. My little brother was just absolutely hypnotized by this, and he kept saying to me, "Greg, what does he do to you? What's Dracula do to you?" I say, "Well, Dracula bites you in the neck and then drinks your blood." "Oh," and then he would say, "Oh, what's the Wolfman do to you?" I said, "Oh, well, the Wolfman, tears you apart with his claws." What's that Frankenstein monster do to you?" "Oh, he picks you up and throws you through the wall."
You and 20 million other guys.
Yeah, that's right.
He wanted to know all the superpowers.
All the superpowers. So we sat there and watched it, and I thought, oh, gee, this is great. As we sat there and enjoyed this, and of course I had no idea that there was such a movie. And the next day of school, the kids were talking about it. A lot of the kids at school had seen it that afternoon, and it was a phenomenon for everybody on the school bus, just as the actual horror films had been several years before. And so that was my actual first introduction. That was my introduction to it. And then from there, I don't know, I guess I saw it another 10, 15 times. And, in the next couple of years, it was on television constantly. So it got to the point I could recite the dialogue along with the comedy.
So it
team.
Sounds like it was one of your favorites as a child, regardless of genre. It was just a go-to film, huh?
It was just a fun film, and there was something happening all the time, and it was very exciting, and had that great chase scene at the end, and of course I was familiar with Abbott and Costello, and always thought they were very funny, enjoyed them very much. So best of both worlds. You had Abbott and Costello, and you had these monsters from Shock Theater, all cavorting together in this movie, and it couldn't get any better.
I'm curious, the shock theater package that Universal or their distributing arm had sold to television markets, was A&C Meet Frankenstein part of that package, do you know?
No, it had not been. This was a different package that came out a little bit later. And it was funny because in Baltimore, at least, by the time Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein came to television, and this would have been maybe around 1962 that we're talking about, a long time ago. The shock theater had gone away from Baltimore, and it was shown in Washington, D.C. For years, over 10 years, on Saturday night after the Late Show. So if you wanted to see an old Universal horror film in Baltimore back during the 1960s, you had to have a strong TV antenna.
Okay.
All right. And you had to sit up very, very late. And you'd sit there, at 2 or 3 in the morning and watching this snowy reception. But it kind of added to the film, added to the ambiance.
Sure.
This was all part of the charm of the movies.
It's sweat equity, brother. It's like you've earned you paid your dues. You got to stay up, slap your face, put some water on your cheeks, and make yourself stay awake because you're going to miss some gold. And again, this is the era where you couldn't just rent it or stream it or wait for it to pop up on cable. You had to wait if you were born after a certain age and you couldn't see it originally in the theater. A film like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, you had to wait until it came around in rotation on your local television station. And it sounds like in your market, it was a pretty regular rotation. I kind of recall in my market, so I grew up in the Chicagoland area, and once I discovered it, which was kind of a happenstance like you, I don't think I had programmed it to, this is going to be on, let's turn it on. I think it just was on TV, and I decided to keep watching it. Greg, I think I was about 8 or so, and it was on WGN Channel 9 in my local market, and I remember it being a bit more frightening than it was funny at that younger age, especially the scenes involving the Wolfman, because he always gave me the willies.
Oh, yeah. He was always the most frightening of the three.
Oh, yeah. And I remember being excited to see it again over the years, and it was replayed quite a bit more than some of the other, Universal films in my area. But you'd have to wait until it was shown again on rerun theater, as this was well before, as I said, cable or home video. And that, you relish the overall enjoyment of that patience, that waiting for that. But also, to me, you relish the tonal duality of this film, the fact that it was comical and scary, which made it special.
Exactly. You weren't expecting it to be both ways. I mean, you wouldn't think you could possibly, have your cake and eat it too with a film like this, that it couldn't possibly be funny as well as scary. But they pulled it off. They actually pulled it off and did it, magnificently well, so that I would say it's probably, it's certainly my favorite all-time horror comedy, but for many people, their favorite, and certainly one of the most famous.
Absolutely.
Maybe the most famous. And of course, that more recognizable title. And it's kind of funny that originally when they began shooting it, it was called The Brain of Frankenstein. They didn't have Bud and Lou's name in the credits originally, because that's what the story was basically about finding a brain for the Frankenstein monster. So it was called The Brain of Frankenstein. But then, of course, I think Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein became the real, that was the great selling point.
Yeah, no, it was a much better title in terms of not only marketing and appeal, but just, name recognition. And I always wondered, Frankenstein has always been my favorite of the monsters, and I just generically call him Frankenstein, not the Frankenstein monster, as most people have come to. But I always wondered, why didn't they just call it Abbott and Costello Meet the Monsters? That would sound a bit more appropriate because it's more than just Frankenstein. And in all honesty, Dracula has much more screen time, and so does the Wolfman. I know I'm grasping at straws here and being a bit nitpicky, but had that ever been in the running, just Meet the Monsters?
I don't believe so. I think they stuck with that Brain of Frankenstein idea and then just kept the monsters name in it. But you make a very good point, which is the fact that the Frankenstein monster, probably because of the money it had made for the studio over the years, those particular films, that was always the real big gun. That was the big name. That was the superstar name. The others were great too, but the Frankenstein monster was kind of the king.
Yes, it had the most sequels, and it probably had the most appeal in terms of coming back to theaters.
That's right.
So I guess it makes sense. It just, in retrospect, I just wondered why they didn't think about an alternate title. But again, who cares? It's a great title.
Yeah, the Frankenstein monster did the most to keep the studio open. I mean, it was still Universal in those days. It was largely because of Frankenstein's monster.
Amazing. Yeah, it still remains the crown jewel of the Universal Monsters canon to me, too. All of the sequels involved included. So why and how does this film remain one of the all-time great horror comedies? Let's get into that. You went out on the record, said it's your favorite horror comedy. It's probably my number 2. I would say Young Frankenstein still is the funniest. It's pretty hard to top that, but it's, I mean, you're talking about 1 and 1A perhaps in my book.
Yeah,
here. So,
Young Frankenstein is great. Yeah, I know. I'm
absolutely
right with you on that.
But yeah, why is it deserving of 75th birthday kudos? What would you say, Greg?
Well, it's a funny answer. It sounds like I'm I'm winging, making this up as a crazy answer. But honestly, I think a large part of it is the script.
Mm-hmm.
For most people, you say, the script of Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, and they're going to roar with laughter. They're going to say they actually had a script. A movie like that had a script. Well, it had an extremely carefully done script, and with motivation and with everything very intricately interwoven and everything in it, and so that everything worked. They're very careful to make sure that everything worked, and again, this story about the brain of Frankenstein, which was that this basic story is, Dracula is trying to gain his evil power, all right? And he wants to have the Frankenstein monster as his henchman, and he wants to put a new brain into the monster that is going to be obedient. And as his glamorous lady doctor friend says, brain that will, follow you around as if it were a trained dog's brain, all right? And so, of course, who do you think they're looking for? They're going to go after Lou Costello, because he turns out in the movie to be, the least intelligent intellectual person they can that they've been able to find.
Perfectly logical in the ANC universe. Yes,
that's right. That's right. So they decided they're going to make it. They want to get his brain to put into the monster's body, and then Dracula will have this magnificent goon basically at his command that can go in and smash everybody up and beat everybody up. He's certainly not on the level of the atom bomb, which had fallen 3 years before, but he's nevertheless, this magnificent horror character who will strike terror and do all kinds of ungodly things. So there they are. And meanwhile, the Wolfman is the hero of the story. The Wolfman has become the hero. He's trying to stop them. He's trying to keep Dracula from doing this, and he wants to put a halt to this terrible power scheme that Dracula has.
And that subplot is important because it will eventually pit the monsters against each other.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. So it all comes to this climax, this conclusion in which everybody's chasing each other, literally all around the castle. All right, in which they're, everybody's fighting for what they want, and everybody is trying to achieve what they need. And it becomes it's like a jigsaw puzzle. It's very nicely put together. Mm-hmm. And so the script really, really works. And they were very careful with that to get it to so they had a really good, smooth scenario for this story. And so as a result, the story, you get interested in it. You get interested in the motivations. You get interested in why the characters are doing what they're doing. They're not just being silly. They're not just putting on a crazy skit. They're not just, Lou's not just screaming and terrified, and the monster's not just growling, and Dracula's not just flopping around.
Although Costello still was a naysayer. He said, I think you quoted in your commentary, that my daughter can write better material than this.
That's right. That's right. No, he thought this was going to be terrible. He thought this was going to be absolutely horrible. Mm-hmm. And so he just refused. I mean, he was a very hot-headed character, and he just once he took a stand on something, and he wouldn't change. So when this whole premise came along, he didn't want to have anything to do with it, which is very odd, because back like in the early 40s at one point, he and Bud were actually thinking about doing a Broadway show in which they actually met monsters, mm-hmm. all right, and which they, sort of like a burlesque show with monsters, in which this kind of thing would happen. And then it didn't. And then when it didn't, and somebody else later came up with a similar idea, he just, put his foot down and said, no, stupid idea, bad idea. No, I don't want anything to do with it. Give me something else. My daughter can write something better than that, as you say. And so he didn't want anything to do with it. But he had a terrific script and to work from. They all did. And, the delineations of the characters and what made them tick and what they were after and all these sorts of things, it was all there. So that's what really was, I think, a big first step on making this movie work, was the fact that they had a great script, which of course is usually the case. You get it, it ain't on the page, it ain't on the stage, thing they always say.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what it is. They had something that could really go on the stage or in front of the camera, mm-hmm. and let it roll.
Yeah, and that script is important because it's not just about the plot. It's about the one-liners and the gags and the jokes that are written in the script as well. So they've finely tuned this for Abbott Costello. And, just like the Marx Brothers films and a lot of other comedy teams, This is carefully scripted, carefully choreographed stuff. It's not like they're making it up on the fly and they're just, saying action. Let's see what you can do. This is well rehearsed, carefully crafted material.
Very much so.
And that's the key to really great film comedies. We've learned, right?
Yeah,
is that
that's it.
They're just not making it up on the fly.
Yeah, all these great comedians, of course, as you know, they're all fastidious with their art, if you will. They were all, all the rehearsals and all the things they went through, like the Marx Brothers, going out and trying material out on the road for a long time before they would put it in the movie and stuff like that. So they had to make sure they got it right down, all the timing and everything down, right down to the second, for this to work.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And they did.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you ask me, in answer to this question, what makes Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein great and memorable and worthy of celebration, 75 years later, it's everything you said, but it's also things that are taken for granted, but need to be mentioned, right? It's a brilliant pairing of two disparate yet adjacent elements, comedy and horror, laughs and gasps.
Right.
Humorous heavyweights like Abbott and Costello, alongside the all-time greatest old school monsters in Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman, the holy trio of classic horror.
Absolutely.
And for the same reason, Greg, that, sweet and salty blend so well together. You think of chocolate and peanut butter, for example. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein proved that silly and scary, they can complement each other quite well. And this is not the first ever horror comedy. I looked up, and I'm sure you can confirm, but, you have to give nods to something like the Harold Lloyd short Haunted Spooks from 1920, maybe D.W. Griffith's feature One Exciting Night from 1922. There were many predecessors to this, but it is the granddaddy that everybody remembers as far as a horror comedy with the most fondness, long before Young Frankenstein or Shaun of the Dead or What We Do in the Shadows, some modern horror comedy masterpieces that are so well beloved today, can maybe tip a cap to a film like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Yes, very much so. And a film that did come out ahead of it, which is also a classic, and a classic horror comedy, Our Stuck in Old Lace.
Sure.
Which is, of course, another case in which you have this juxtaposition you're talking about. These two very, very sweet old ladies who are doing absolutely the last thing you'd ever imagine them to do, which is, poisoning old men and burying them in the cellar of their house. And it's like, it's such a contrast there, of what is happening, and what you would expect to happen in the first 5 minutes of the play, and what's happening in it a half hour later,
right,
or in the film. It's just, it's amazing, and I think that's how it works. You need an element of surprise and an element of juxtaposition as to what's going on, and that's what really makes a terrific horror comedy.
No question about it. Any 75-year-old film is going to have some creakiness, certainly, but. For me, many of the one-liners, many of the amusing bits in this picture, they still land.
Oh, yeah.
I know you think I'm crazy, but in a half an hour, the moon will rise and I'll turn into a wolf.
You and 20 million other guys.
The moving candle gag, which was actually first seen in their film Hold That Ghost 7 years earlier.
What's the matter now? You know that person you said that there's no such person?
Yes.
I think he's in there, in person. I was reading the sign over here, this one down here.
Yeah.
Dracula's Legend. All of a sudden I heard...
That's the wind.
It should get oiled.
And my favorite funny bone moment of them all it actually is when the monster recoils in revulsion after seeing Costello's face.
Oh! Don't be afraid. He won't hurt you.
That's one of the rare examples, as you pointed out on the commentary, where the monsters kind of break form and they're kind of in on the joke, if you will. But to me, I still think that's the funniest.
It was
bit.
Irresistible.
Yeah.
They had to have it in there. It was absolutely irresistible. It worked so well. It worked so well. Yeah, and a little risque too. I mean, there's the part early in the film when Lenore Albert, who is the sultry assistant to Dracula, is there and talking to Abbott and Costello, and she's trying to going to have another date with Lou because she's wooing him so that they can eventually kidnap him and take his brain. But Abbott can't understand what she sees in Lou. And at one point he turns to her and he says,
"Frankly, I don't get it."
And frankly, you never will.
And it's like, whoa.
Good double entendre there, right?
Yeah. And you think, what's a 1948 movie? I mean, today's a big deal, but 1948, that's racy stuff.
Sure.
So, it's got all kinds of humor. It's got the slapstick. It's got the subtle. It has all the different. It runs the gamut as far as the type of humor that the film offers.
And I love the parts where Costello, I'm sure, I know he does this in his other films too. He'll break the fourth wall and he'll actually look at and kind of, wink at the audience where, for example, he pulls that tablecloth out. Nothing falls from the tabletop.
Yeah, he's real pleased.
Right. Or when I think he gets the kiss from the insurance investigator and he kind of looks at the camera, if I recall. So there's a couple times in there where he's winking at the audience a little bit. So very playful, very, very mirthful. But then on the other side, the shots like when the Wolfman is ready to pounce on Costello, and of course Costello is oblivious to the danger, it immediately takes me back to my first watch, when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up during those scenes. It's not scary today. I'm a grown-ass man. But again, it's testament to how this film can bring you back to your childhood and make you think back on when you first saw a scary scene like that, which might have happened just a moment after something funny. And again, that contrast, that seesawing between comedy and horror, it really, I don't know what it is. It just touches a nerve. And it doesn't matter what age you are. It just kind of tickles you somehow.
Yeah.
And I can't put my finger on it. I'm not a psychologist, a psychiatrist. There's got to be some effect going on there.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, brighter minds have expostulated on this phenomenon before. But yeah, it really works well, especially when you consider that this film is of course targeted more to kids and families, serves as kind of a great gateway to the Universal classic monsters, if you will. But make no mistake, it can be a little spooky, a little scary if you're younger and you're seeing things like that for the first time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, it's so funny to think that when the film was released originally in 1948 and so many kids went to see it, even though the film made, enormous money for the exhibitors and for the theater owners and the studio. All right, that the studio, the theater owners were really kind of upset because the fact that the kids would scream so wildly and desperately. You'd hear them across the street. They'd run out of the theater, into traffic. They tear, literally, there were reports of them tearing the seats out of the theaters.
Amazing.
They would get so excited and so worked up. They'd yell at the screen. If Costello was standing there and Dracula was coming up behind him or something, they'd be screaming, watch out, watch out, watch out, screaming and carrying on and hiding behind the chairs, all this sort of thing. And, it was like a riot. That was going on in the theater with the kid audiences, so it was almost like this almost isn't worth it. Some of the theater owners wrote into the exhibitor magazines. They said because we took such a pounding physically, with this movie, with this explosive response from the children in the audience, that I don't think we ever want to do this again.
Well, I just talked to my guest for The Exorcist, Alexandre Felipe, about that same phenomenon with The Exorcist when it came out. I know it's a completely different movie, but it's similar how all those decades later, you could still have a powerfully impactful horror film that causes the audience to react so expressively, sometimes violently, sometimes hysterically, like you said, running out of the theater. So it speaks to the craftsmanship that's involved with a really good horror film. But I'm curious here, you bring up like the kids screaming and running around. Was this a film that, I realize you weren't alive at the time to see that in 1948, but do you know from your research, was this a film that like the parents would drop the kids off and they'd be there by themselves in a matinee or something? Or was this a film where the whole family would go to kind of, make sure Junior is protected?
It was both. The matinees, again, this was a summer release. The matinees frequently were very, very large. Percentage of them were kids. In the evening, the parents would go because they had come to believe that Abbott and Costello were fairly wholesome entertainment. They were funny, they were comedians, they were particularly, I think male audiences particularly enjoyed them and the weird camaraderie they had, that sort of thing. That going on. And I think that in the evening audiences, they had this a similar reaction, but not quite as violent as with the kids.
Maybe with mom and dad there, they kind of kept their kids in check a little more.
Yeah. So it's a great date movie. It's a great movie to take a date to because of the fact that, again, think of all the screaming and all the excitement and all the, you left totally emotionally exhausted and drained by having seen this. So it kind of worked on a bunch of different levels. The kids loved it. The families felt that they could go because after all, it was Abbott and Costello, and a sailor who had a gal, they wanted to take out for a date that night. Hey, what better picture than Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein? I'm kind of a ball at this one, baby. So so it worked. It had a great cross the spectrum audience.
Sure.
waiting to see it. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's easy so many decades removed to look at an antique film like this and think about it, maybe regard it as much more quaint and kind of innocent and harmless. But again, in its time in 1948, this would have been scary to even some adults, to families. It would have been perhaps more funny to people of that era. Maybe today some of the jokes don't land as powerfully. But again, to put it in proper context, it was a very impactful film as both a comedy and a horror film.
Yeah, and of course they soft pedal it in this, but again, a lot of people, it was sort of like the situation with my brother Randy and me, in the sense that some of the people knew the background of these characters, and they knew, for example, that Frankenstein's monster was actually put together from corpses that were stolen from cemeteries, and they knew that Dracula was supposed to be this horrible demonic creature, and they knew that the Wolfman was suffering from this dreadful curse that it caused him to become one of the damned, and these sorts of things. So this was heavy stuff that Bud and Lou were dealing with here. These were really the absolute scariest characters that ever hit the movies. And so again, there's no real exposition in the film where they say, well, hello, I'm Dracula and I'm demonic, or let me introduce you to my friend Frankenstein's monster who was sewn together bit by bit from kind of. They don't go there. They assume that it. But even for people who knew it, I mean, you're still seeing Bud and Lou up there, with these sort of unholy creatures,
right,
who are after them, these almost supernatural creatures. So it's a lot different than the gangsters they were frequently, with or something of that nature. They had some really nasty stuff going on up there with these guys. So yeah, but as you said, the extremes of the two just gelled.
To your point a moment ago, yeah, it seems as if they're a bit more neutered, if you will, a little more neutralized in terms of maybe their scare impact. But make no mistake, there's still shades of darkness in these characters. There's a bit of the pathos of the Frankenstein monster and maybe some of the sympathy you'd feel for him and just the way he looks and lumbers around and, can't really speak for himself. And then you think of Dracula, like that great scene where he bites the assistant's neck, the doctor's neck, Sandra, and you see her reflection in the mirror, and it looks like she's a bit ecstatic in an erotic way, right? Like it's a hint of the sexuality inherent in the Dracula character, even in a 1948 film geared toward kids. In the Wolfman character, of course, as we've already discussed, can still be absolutely frightening, absolutely terrifying. He can rip people apart. He can sever your jugular vein. So I'm not trying to belabor the point here. It is a somewhat frivolous film in the sense of you can't take the plot or anything, the proceedings that seriously. But again, we're talking about it 75 years later for a good reason. It's a well-made movie. And I think if I could kind of branch off to a similar point, it's also deserving of respect from fans of the Universal Classic monsters because while it places them in a comedic context, I think the Wolfman, Dracula, and Frankenstein's monster, they're allowed to be frightening without necessarily being disrespected or humiliated.
You're absolutely right.
Yes, you have Costello kicking the Wolfman in his butt.
That's
yes,
right.
you have, Frankenstein lurching back in revulsion in a comedic moment. But their appearances here, I would argue they don't denigrate their legacies or their reputations or their impact as supernatural, fiendish antagonists.
No.
Do you agree?
Absolutely. And I think that this was a decision that was made very early. It was made in the script and was also made by Charles Barton, the director, who decided when he directed the film that this was it, that you had to have respect for these characters. And it was interesting because he said all those years ago when I talked with him, he said that Abbott and Costello had great respect for the actors who were playing the roles. They had great respect for Lugosi and Cheney and Glenn Strange, who played the monster. Although they goofed around on the set and threw pies at each other and all kinds of crazy stuff, that they would never do anything to make these other actors uncomfortable or to denigrate them or anything of that nature. They were always very respectful to them and grateful to them for their professionalism and for helping make them look good. So it kind of carried over into the characters that on the screen, and that is that that these are the great triumvirate of horror characters from the 30s and the war years of the 40s.
Right.
And here they are, And you don't mess with these boys. You don't make fun of them. They're too austere. They're too great to take that kind of abuse. A little bit of kidding here and there is perfectly fine. Everybody can take kidding, but you can't make the movie make fools of them. And they never. And there's nowhere in the movie that they really do. As you mentioned, there's that bit with Cheney where he's falling around in the trees and he gets kicked in the butt and that sort of thing. But that's works in of itself, and also works because of the fact that they need an excuse for him not to catch Costello.
Of course.
So he has to be a little clumsy. But no, they all played their roles as if it were a straight film.
Dracula's still going to bite people, and the Frankenstein monster is still going to throw people to their death. And
that's right.
The Wolfman is still going to bite people's, necks off, if you will. And so I don't think it diminishes their impact. I know Lon Chaney Jr., I think he was the one who, stated that they made clowns, if you will, of the monsters. And I realize there's that train of thought about a film like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. But when you consider that it's the last of its kind, right? I mean, it's kind of the swan song for this whole cycle. It's okay. It's not like they followed it up with a bunch of serious horror films starring Dracula, Frankenstein, or the Wolfman too. So to me, it's kind of an appropriate send-off.
It is.
And also, before we get into that point, because I definitely want to ask you about that, I think it remains a crucial text, Greg, because for many kids, it has served and will continue to serve as I said, this gateway to vintage horror. It's a first path that often leads to eventual viewings of the Universal Classic Monster series, as well as other black and white films of any genre. I mean, this work is a fantastic way to introduce youngsters to the merits of classic movies, I would argue.
Excellent point. Yeah.
Interestingly, you know who Svengoolie is, right? The TV horror host.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
He carries this mantle of a spokesperson of sorts for classic horror movies, and he continues to be watched by millions across the country. So recently, he noted in his October newsletter that Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein could be the movie his fans most request him to schedule again and again and again. Yes. He didn't necessarily say that, this was the one he scheduled the most, but it's the one he gets the most requests for.
That's great. That's very good to hear, and perfectly understandable because, the movie has, with all the other great things in it, it has that great star power. Costello has star power. The three villains all have star power. It's wonderful to watch them and get those vibes coming off the screen, even after all these years, to see them in action. So yeah, very, very much so. As far as you mentioned about being a send-off, it really did. It really kind of dropped the curtain very effectively on the original horror films at Universal because of the fact that it gave them a very graceful out. All right. Let them go out first of all, in a film that was wildly successful, right? Made, as we mentioned earlier, made a great amount of money.
Yeah, box office matters, sure.
Very, very big in its year of its release. All right. It also treated them all with respect. It also gave them all some terrific moments. All right, in there that in which they all shine. It made them all the legends. You saw them as the legends that they're supposed to be. They were all came off that way in the film, and it was a graceful ending. It was a big for what it was, a big budget picture with beautiful sets, beautiful cinematography, great direction. Director was hitting a bullseye all the way through about how he wanted everything to come together.
Oh, I would say the art direction and set direction for this film are among its secret weapons. Right? I love the look and atmosphere of McDougal's House of Horrors. That remains my favorite sequence in the film.
Yeah.
And the design of that island castle, especially its unexpectedly bright laboratory, the shadowy secret passages.
Yeah.
So, again, good point about the art direction.
Yeah. So, all that thing it's an absolute A+ production. So they were able to go out on a bang. Yes. And that was the thing that was great about it. They were able to go out in a bang, and they were able to go out with a big superstar comedy team, all right, who got laughs while at the same time letting them play it straight, letting them be who they were, and it just really played well. It played beautifully. It still does. It stands the test of time. Yeah.
If you dissect how this film is perhaps unique or distinctive, or the first, or for that matter, last of its kind for Universal and the horror cycle that began in 1931, let's count the ways, right? This represents, as you were saying, the final appearance of these monsters, of the classic triumvirate, Dracula, Frankenstein, and Wolfman, in this era, right? It's the last of its kind, and as far as this series. It's also the last of the studio's monster rallies or monster mashups that began in 1943, in which 2 or more of this trio of characters get paired up.
That's
And
right.
this, of course, marked the end of an era that launched in, as I said, 31. That's when Dracula and Frankenstein came out that same year. First release. Universal abandoned these classic monsters and kind of the European-inspired Gothic horrors for what? For atomic age creatures.
Mm-hmm.
It rolled out things in the 50s like Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Mole People, aliens like the Metaluna mutants in This Island Earth.
That's right.
So things were changed. They still dabbled in monsters, but it was a different kind.
Yes.
And it's also significant. We have to mention this is only the second and the final casting of Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula in any film.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
It's 17 years since he initially played the character in the film. Earlier than that, he stormed Broadway with the role. But it lends this movie a sheen of gravitas and authenticity that the man we most associate with this role has returned, even if he gets fourth billing after Bud Liu and Lon Chaney Jr. Yeah. Lugosi benefits from a significant career comeback here and a fitting return to form, so it's no small point that you have the master in his role of the head vampire.
Yeah, it ends as it began. Dracula really is considered the sort of the baptism of the horror genre at Universal, and then when we get to the end and then the lights are dimming, he comes back again in the role, and as you mentioned, all right, for only the second time. He's there in the beginning, he's there at the end. He's in the other vampire roles in other studios at other times.
That's true.
Throughout the 30s and 40s, but never Dracula.
That's right.
And there he is, and he's still got all the majesty. He's still got all the allure. He still has all the hypnotic power. It's a different performance than the earlier film, because the earlier film, of course, is more dated. And he's playing in Abbott and Costello made Frankenstein. He's playing it a little more, a little faster, a little more clipped, to suit the film. Nevertheless, absolutely the same character with all the same deviltry. And he's wonderful, absolutely wonderful to watch in it.
Yes, agreed. This movie has a seemingly bottomless purse of horror film riches because it boasts Lugosi as well as Lon Chaney Jr. in the part that only he ever played, the Wolfman.
Right.
Glenn Strange, for my money, he's the second best performer to play Frankenstein's monster after Karloff for Universal. And you even have Vincent Price, whose voice makes a cameo as the Invisible Man at the conclusion. So it's one hit after another here.
Yeah.
And while it was the denouement for the big three monsters, Greg, it did kick off a series of films pairing Bud and Lou with other household name horror entities. Next came Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer Boris Karloff, and then Meet the Invisible Man, Meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and finally Meet the Mummy. So there's a nice little subgenre franchise going on here, at least for a few more years.
Yeah, they milked it. They thought, okay, well, this works. Let's try some more, and along the same lines. But of course, none of them are in the same category as the original.
No,
and none of them are up there with Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. But so yeah, the film sort of it drops the curtain, but it also kind of brings another one up, because then they have a whole other route to run here with with these other horror characters that they do, and so the beat went on. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, it reunites, as we said, Lon Chaney Jr. and Bela Lugosi. But I think it's too bad that Boris Karloff is missing in the role of the Frankenstein monster. So why didn't Karloff appear in this film? And do you think that was a missed golden opportunity, as it would have been the only pairing ever of Lugosi, Karloff, and Chaney Jr. in a feature film for Universal?
Certainly would have been cool to have seen him, as you say, as part of that trio. It's very interesting about Karloff, and that's this, and that at the time that they were making this film, they're making Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein at Universal. Karloff got an offer to do a Broadway play called The Linden Tree. All right, and it was a very serious, sophisticated drama. J.B. Priestley, and Karloff loved it. It was about, because the theme of it was continuing to going on with what you love in life, no matter how old you get, and this sort of thing. And so he was very much appreciative, of the theme, and he was very, very excited about the play. Years ago, I worked at an auction house, and they offered some material on Karloff, a lot of stuff on Karloff. And the biggest file he had, he didn't save very much at all from his career, but the biggest file he had in that collection was his file on the Linden Tree. All right. Now, you probably never heard of it. If you didn't, you're not alone. Almost nobody has ever heard of it. All right. But he did this play, and it didn't last a week. It ran, I think, 7 performances or something like that.
Oh boy.
Very, very short run. But he loved the play. And so when it came time to save anything on it, he actually had this big, fairly fat folder with, clippings and news things and blurbs and ads and so on about the linden tree. So what he had done is he had a chance to do either, he could have done, Costello Meet Frankenstein, or he could have done this play, The Linden Tree. He did The Linden Tree. So you might say, well, what a lost opportunity. It was for us. For him, I don't think he would have, if he had known it was only going to run a week, I think he would have done the play anyway. He just was in love with this play and just thought it was wonderful and couldn't wait to do it. And even though it bombed and, fell down, burned up in a week, he was just very, very proud of it and very proud of his performance in it. And so he was going a different direction, I guess is the best way to put it, as far as where his life and career were going. So he did the play rather than do the movie. It's funny that they hired him in New York, where he was living at the time, to pose in front of the theater where Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was showing, and look kind of curiously at the marquee and point up at it like, what's this all about?
Yeah.
He said, I'll do it, but as long as I don't have to see the movie.
Funny.
Which I guess gives some insight into how he felt about the whole prospect. Knowing Karloff, I doubt if he ever saw it. I think if he did see it, he'd have been surprised at how good it was. I think that he was like a lot of actors. They don't go to their own work because they're too self-critical, and they just say, I did it. I don't want to have to look at it. Yeah,
exactly. But he was also rather protective of the Frankenstein character that he helped create.
He was.
So do you think there was some level of, well, I don't really want to revisit that character in this context because it's going to denigrate that character, or it's going to diminish my fondness for him, for that matter?
It could be. There were a number of good reasons why he, maybe should not have done it. I know that when he did Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, which was the first sequel to Frankenstein, there were a lot of comic moments in there put in by James Whale, and Carl was very unhappy about that. He didn't like any of that.
Yeah, he didn't want to speak, for example.
No spoofs. Yeah, no, no. He was not happy about this this kind of weird humor, almost Monty Python kind of thing that Whale was doing with the film. And when it's Son of Frankenstein, same thing. There were certain things in there that he didn't like.
And he has less screen time ever by the time of that second sequel. Although he's still fantastic in it, but maybe he just realized it's diminishing returns by this point.
That's right, diminishing returns, and he figured that he didn't want to be part of the monster going downhill.
Plus, he had a lot of health issues, back problems.
That's the other thing.
Maybe he's worried about, hey, if I got to wear that suit and makeup again and lumber around, I'm going to be kind of creaky and achy.
Yeah, he might have had an awful lot of time of the role being spent with doubles. He was not. As you say, he was at an age at that point where he had a lot of serious back trouble and surgery.
And what age would he have been in 48? Do you know?
Early 60s.
Yeah, close to where Lugosi was 65, right? So, I mean, they're both up there. It's understandable that he would turn it down. But again, horror fans, they have a fair right to wonder, what if?
Yeah. And of course, the other thing with Karloff as the monster is the fact that, he's a very eccentric performance. And I mean that in a very, admirable way. His monster, his mannerisms that he always had, the way he moved, the way he growled, the way his facial expressions, everything, all those things were brilliant. They were brilliant acting. And those things might not have worked in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. They didn't really have time for it. You know what I mean? They needed a more streamlined monster who would be big and powerful and funny, funny in the sense of usable as a comic butt a little bit here and there, like when he did a scene in the chair where Lou sits on his lap. And
sure, and that's where Glenn Strange really shines, because
he's just a big lumbering enormous.
He absolutely looks the part, and he's just this real gentleman, sweet guy who's gonna take one for the team, whatever is called for in the scene. And you can rely on him.
Exactly. So I think that's what they needed in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and they didn't need the more quirky characterization that Karloff would have given it, and he realized that, and he was in very good shape. He was in very good financial shape at that point. He had done the play Arsenic on Old Lace, and he was probably at that point a millionaire, and he,
Sure.
could be choosy about what he wanted to do, and I guess he figured, yeah, why should I, denigrate the monster and meanwhile break my back, and meanwhile,
It makes sense. It makes sense. But still,
yeah,
I often question, boy, it would have been amazing to have those three together.
those three together would have
Yeah.
been, it would have been history, and it would almost feel like in that sense, it almost like he owed it to Hollywood history to do it, so just so they all could be together at that one point.
Oh, well, what are you going to do? Let's talk briefly about Charles Barton, because nobody knows this name, right? I mean, nobody remembers the name Charles Barton. But what directorial choices of his do you admire in this film?
Well, I think that he somehow he got wonderful stuff out of Bud and Lou. When I say somehow, I mean they were always wonderful, but I mean he got them at their absolute best. He directed a number of their movies, and in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, despite the fact that that Lou was very unhappy about the film, he got him effervescent, he got him all keyed up, he got him perfect, zeroed in on him, and got a really good performance out of him. And of course, with the three monsters, again, he approached them with the same dignity that Abbott and Costello did. He was able to say, okay, he even went to them and he would say, tell me, what do you think you should do here? Like with Lugosi, in this scene with the girl by them when you're about to kiss her, will you work with her for a while, and come back and show me what you've got, and show me how you think Dracula would really do this. You know a lot more about Dracula certainly than I do. Charlie Barton knows, all right.
Yeah.
So you take charge of this, and then when you come back, we'll set it for camera. He was a wonderful man. He was one of the sweetest guys I ever met in this business. He was and he went way back, and he had done all kinds of things, and he had worked with William Wellman. He had written gags for the Marx Brothers. He had been a Disney director. He was a phenomenal man, and I can understand him working with so many people because he has such an incredibly engaging personality himself. He's a very, very sweet, nice man.
Yeah, it's an impressive filmography, not only just the prolific nature of his work, but as you said, I mean, he's doing all these kind of behind the scenes things for some giants well before he's teamed with Abbott and Costello. So he'd paid his dues, and I'm not saying he's some hack or journeyman or what have you, but again, nobody knows this name, nobody remembers the name.
No.
But I would argue that whatever he's doing here, it worked great.
It sure did. He really nailed it. It's funny if anybody ever wants to actually get a look at him, he's in the great 1939 Beau Geste. He plays a part. He plays one of there's two cowboys who joined the Foreign Legion in that. One of them's played by Broderick Crawford, and the other one's played by Charlie Barton. And he did it because Barton did it because he was good friends with William Wellman, of course, who was the producer and director of that Beau Geste. But what a shame he's not still around, because in addition to the fact that he was an extremely lovable and delightful man, boy, he knew Hollywood history. I mean,
he probably had some stories to tell, right? Like where the skeletons are and the bodies are buried, and all the pie fights you didn't know about, right?
The pie fights. He had been through it all. Yeah. Plus, I believe he'd been married about 7 times.
Wow.
So I guess we probably have some stories about that,
there
too.
You go. There's at least 3 books waiting to be written right there.
Right.
I was going to ask you, what do you make of the Walter Lantz animation effects in this movie? You had said in a commentary that he's not credited, but it's widely believed that it's Walter Lantz, the animator, for example, the Woody Woodpecker cartoons.
Yes.
Who's responsible for the cartoons in this film. So you have that wonderful opening animated sequence. You have some effects where, for example, the bat turns it back into Dracula or vice versa.
Yeah.
Do these cartoonish effects look a bit cheesy and juvenile, or do you think they fit well?
Well, they may look a little bit that way now, all these years later.
Sure.
75 years later. But at the time, they certainly worked. And I remember, again, the first time seeing the film and seeing them and just thinking, well, that's what they have to do in a movie like this to get the idea across, is they have to put in this kind of animation so that you understand what's going on. But there's nothing in the studio paperwork about Walter Lantz actually having done it. There's nothing in it that he didn't do it either. But he was at Universal at the time, and it would have been sensible that he would have been the one that did the sequences.
Yeah, I'm not calling on you to be an animation expert, but it kind of looks like his style.
It does look his style. No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
It looks very much like something that he would do. So maybe somebody will actually locate the definitive answer to that. But it is a wonderful opening with that cartoon sequence.
Absolutely. Paired with the score, too. The theme song is fantastic, too.
Yeah, they all go parading by, and the monster puts his arms up and the girl's eyes blink, and it's really, really cool.
Great
Sets
stuff.
the mood right away.
Great stuff. Okay, a few perhaps rhetorical or inconsequential questions for the Universal Monsters expert. Now, you don't have to answer all these. I'm just going to rattle them off, and maybe we'll go into a couple of them.
Okay.
You did a great job of explaining the plot in a basic way, okay? But why and how does Dracula want to use the Frankenstein monster? And why is Larry Talbot determined to destroy them, both of them? Why the heck is this film set in Florida, a place you don't exactly associate with Gothic or classic horror? I mean, isn't the Sunshine State a bit silly of a setting for a monster mash? In the scene where Dracula presumably bites Sandra's neck, as you point out in the commentary, why does he cast a reflection in the mirror? Was the vampire continuity person asleep at the switch here? Did men really go by the name or moniker Chick in 1948? What's up with that? For a film primarily aimed at kids and families, isn't it a little bit violent that the Frankenstein monster throws Sandra out the window? And as a thrown flower pot, the best that the king of the vampires can do to fend off the Wolfman? What do you have to say, Greg?
Oh, gee, man, I'm not sure where to start.
Throwing a lot at you there.
Yeah. It's, they're all actually excellent questions. The Florida is a very, very strange place for a horror film. I will absolutely agree with that. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense.
It reminds me of that Mummy sequel where isn't it set in the swamps or something?
Louisiana.
Yeah, the bayou, and what the heck is that?
It goes down in a swamp in New England and ends up in Louisiana. That's just totally bizarre. But they have as far as the mirror, the only thing I can come up with the mirror is the fact that I think that maybe they figured a lot of people who went to see this particular film had forgotten the idea that a vampire doesn't show a reflection. And so if they went to all the time and trouble to take his reflection out of the mirror, all right, when he kissed her, then what would happen is people would say, "Where's he? How come I see her and I don't see him?"
Well, how about just shoot it without a mirror?
Just shoot it without a mirror. I mean, that was the other thing. He could take her out on the balcony, right?
Uh-huh.
Out in the balcony, and wrap her up in his beautiful smoking jacket he's wearing in that scene, or whatever, and kiss her and not have her by the mirror. So I don't think anybody really gave any thought to that. I think that just kind of slipped through.
Yeah.
As a Universal fan, however, I always try to give it the benefit of the doubt that they figured that, well, we won't go into all this, hoi polloi about it doesn't show a reflection and blah blah. But no, you're right.
What is Dracula going to do with Frankenstein? It's just one monster. What is he trying to conquer the world? What is he trying to do?
Yeah, that's the thing. And again, we mentioned when we started about this is now the age of the atom bomb. Of course, they don't mention anything about that in the movie. But the war's over and all these horrible weapons have been launched throughout World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And Dracula has the Frankenstein monster, and it's sort of like when you really think about it, you think, yeah, well, so what? I mean, what can they really do? Somebody's will catch him, and they'll do what they used to talk about in the previous films. They'll dissect him, right? They'll just take him apart and throw him away.
Now, there was a similar kind of a plot or insinuation. I don't know if you saw the terrible film Van Helsing from 2004, but it's similar in that Dracula tries to revive or reclaim the monster to use him as some kind of a weapon in his fiendish scheme to rule the world or something. So,
That's right.
I mean, maybe they took a bit of a cue from the plot of this film. And again, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here. Who cares? Nobody really pays attention to the plot. I get it. But again, like, why is Larry Talbot determined to destroy both of the monsters? Does he have some kind of vendetta out? What's going on here? What's motivating him?
You have to figure, I guess, that something happens somewhere between the House movies, the House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, with him and Dracula and the monster, in which he's caught on to what's going on, and they decided to figure that when the audience came, if they didn't remember, that the audience complained, they'd say, "Oh, you don't remember that scene where they all got together and did they?" No, oh God, well, I don't know what's wrong with you that you don't remember that.
Universal was famous for not maintaining continuity between its
Continuity,
sequels. They threw that out the window, and the Mummy
no.
movies are a great example of that.
Yeah,
they're terrific fun, but boy, if you're looking for a through line, forget about it.
Yeah, no continuity. So I guess what the first thing they start off with on a lot of scripts like these, which they did back then, well, they thought, first of all, let's pretty much throw everything out that happened before this, and kind of pick up from right here at the starting line, and then we'll put it all together.
Yeah.
But and if something absolutely demands to be explained, we'll come up with some wacky half-ass explanation for it. But in the meantime, no, we'll just let it let it run its course and figure the audience won't remember. But they're all very good questions. I'm sure that if you had talked to the screenwriters about that back in 1948, they would have said, "Get out of here."
Yeah, I'm not losing any sleep over the answers to these.
Right.
But I have to ask you that name Chick. I mean, do you recall that a name like that being used in other 1940s films? Was this a common nickname or something?
No, I don't know. I can't. No, Chicks. No, the chick was always disparaging remark not some disparaging remark for a young lady.
That's what I'm thinking.
Maybe because it sounded good when he said, "Oh, chick," then when he kept saying through the movie, they thought that's a good rhythm to it.
It rolls off the tongue. It's one syllable. It's
that's right.
So I guess maybe rhythm-wise it works. I have to ask you, you said this is your favorite all-time horror comedy.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think is the best classic horror picture from Universal, period? Is it this one, or is it one of the predecessors?
Best horror picture from Universal, period, I would say is a tie, depending on what mood I'm in at a certain time of the day, I guess, or night. And I would say that the tie would be between Bride of Frankenstein and The Black Cat.
I knew you were going to say The Black Cat. I always knew you were a huge fan of that.
Big fan of The Black Cat.
I think you do the commentary on the Shout Factory version of that.
Right? I do the commentary on The Black Cat, and it's an incredible movie, incredibly dark, incredibly perverse, but incredible acting opportunities for both Lugosi and Karloff. And
could be their best pairing of any of their.
It really is.
They're
absolutely dynamite together. They devour the screen. They're really amazing to watch in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
And they always are together. They have great chemistry on the screen. But they in that particular film, it's like you're watching them in a play that they've done for 6 months or something, and they know each other's exact movements as to what's going on.
It's such a great subversive pre-code kind of horror film too that is delicious to revisit. Right?
It is, and it got in just in time. I mean, it came in just as the strengthening code was coming in, and I think they when it went in for its original script approval thing, that Joseph Breen sent it back, and they did like 20 areas that he said have to be changed. If you're actually going to be serious about proceeding with this movie, 20 changes. So here they go. It turned out they didn't really make any of them. I mean, they left them all in.
Exactly. They pulled a Hitchcock. Oh, okay, I'll change that, and then you don't change anything.
Sure,
right?
sure. So, yeah, it was like Fooey with Breen. He won't notice, including the skinning alive. The movie ends with a skinning alive, and of course, Breen said, "Well, absolutely, there's no way, you can put that on the screen. That's just completely unheard of, and don't even think about it." And it's in there, so
it's there. Not much left of the imagination other than some shadow play. But I have to ask you real quickly, because a good kind of pairing to something like The Black Cat is, let's say, Murders in the Rue Morgue, a lesser film in my opinion. But which of the two do you think is more disturbing, more shocking, not only for the early 30s, but even all these years later? Because again, it is a treat to revisit these pre-code horrors by Universal and even some other studios. And just on our recent rewatch of Murders in the Rue Morgue, it is pretty violent and dark.
It is wildly violent and dark. And of course, if the listeners aren't familiar, it's in Bela Lugosi wants to, made his gorilla with a young, lovely lady of Paris back in 1845. And it's amazing to watch because of this whole premise and the way Lugosi throws himself into it. I think that it's one of my favorites. I would say it's probably one of my 5 favorite Universals.
Wow.
And okay. I love it, but I don't think it's as good as The Black Cat because of the fact that doesn't have quite as much credibility. Not that The Black Cat is bursting with credibility, but it has a little more credibility. Black Cat does, and has a more logical progression. And also, Karloff and Lugosi are in The Black Cat more. Lugosi is in the Rue Morgue has a little less screen time than you'd like him to have.
It's a great character, though, Morocco.
Oh, he's great. He's great, Dr. Morocco. Yeah, he really is. He's marvelous in that film. And in fact, I think that might be my favorite all-time Lugosi performance.
Wow. Okay, so even more than Igor in Son of Frankenstein?
Well, maybe Igor might be. It might. Yeah, you mentioned. I think Igor might edge him out a little bit.
We're a couple of Universal horror nerds, folks, so just bear with us because, boy, we could talk all day about this stuff. We won't, but again, it's fun to kind of parse through. My one problem with The Black Cat, it's a great film, and the visuals, the art direction, everything is just spectacular. It's just a little too much wall-to-wall music for me. The score is a little bit over the top for me, and that diminishes it just a bit. But boy, it is a fun film to rewatch.
Yeah, I think a lot of that was the director Edgar Ulmer. Ulmer was a big classical music nut, and so he wanted music all the way through it. Every nook and cranny had to have music. It is really a pretty amazing movie, and the crazy warped passion in it is just I don't believe I'm watching this kind of thing when you see it. But it really has got everything. It's got everything from devil worship to
necrophilia.
It's all name, but it's probably there.
Playing the whole shebang.
Incest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Quite a far cry from Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So you might want to be careful about introducing little ones to some of these early films, but most of them are relatively tame. And again, if you liked Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein and you haven't really dabbled in some of the other classic monster or Universal classic horror films, do yourself a favor and revisit some of the ones from the early 30s, which is really the golden age of this cycle.
Yeah, it really is. It's one brief thing about the Black Cat, and that is that at one point I wrote something about it and got a letter in the mail one day, and it was from a lady in Texas. There was a picture there of a publicity stunt that they had done. They had tried to they were choosing a black cat to be in the movie, and so they had a bunch of kids all lined up on the back lot, and they were there with Carlton Lugosi, and they were supposed to be selecting this black cat who was going to be the winner that they were going to put into the film. And she said, I was the winner. I was the one. My black cat won the contest and was going to be in the film. And so, of course, I almost immediately, called her up and wanted to talk with her. And she said, oh, you can't believe how nice Karloff was, and you can't believe how nice Lugosi was. And they were so sweet, and they were so gentle, and they were so kind, and everybody was so nice and all this. And you think about that, and you think about the movie, and it's just like, wow. Imagine that kind of crazy goings on, between scenes on the Black Cat, all these kids parading around carrying their black cats. And Karloff and Lugosi there, patting him on the head.
Yep. But it says a lot about the not only professionalism of Karloff and Lugosi, but also their characters, their personalities. Very friendly, cordial, kind, gentle people.
They really were. They were great gentlemen, and they were very, 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 always very, very nice to their fans and anybody who met them. And they were, it was uncanny. Yeah, of the difference of them. In real life and what you were seeing up there on the big screen.
All right, one more question, Greg, and we'll let you go. But we've arrived at the diamond anniversary of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Anniversaries, birthdays, they're a time for giving presents. Only it's the fans who continue to receive the gifts when a beloved film marks a milestone year. So let me ask you, what is this movie's greatest gift to viewers?
I think it's folklore. It's interesting, when the film first came out, one of the critics said that the movie is basically folklore, and that is what it is. It is folklore. It has the three legendary monsters of Hollywood, all there in the same film, all of them having great moments, all of them seemingly having fun. The actors certainly seemingly having fun. They're there with Abbott and Costello, who are two of the biggest stars in the world. They're in a very in a deluxe motion picture, which again, as we've mentioned, has been fastidiously put together, from the script right up to the cinematography, the art direction, everything. But the characters who really shine, I think, in it, who people really go off remembering, and who obviously are going to be those three monster characters. It's going to be Lon Chaney's Wolfman, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, Glenn Strange's Frankenstein monster, and they are the folklore. They are these mythical characters. They become mythical characters because of how much we love them and how much we've watched them, and the impact they've had on audiences over all the decades, and all these things. And here they are in this great, fun, enjoyable movie. You don't have to watch the movie to be scared. You can watch the movie to laugh. All right, or you can watch the movie to both laugh at it and to be scared by it. But however you choose to approach it, they're there, and they're in all their glory. And as you mentioned, it's a great starting point. All right, if you want to get into this incredible, crazy, beloved genre that we're talking about. And it's also a really incredible entertainment, I guess is the word to use. It's an entertainment. It's got it all there. It's got, you even got some tragedy in there with Lon Chaney's Wolfman, and sadness with Karloff's Monster, and a certain remoteness with Lugosi's Dracula, and that they were able to still get these little things, these little nuances going in there, even working with Abbott and Costello. So I think that's what it is. I think it's the folklore of Hollywood, really, is seeing these three legendary monsters all kicking up their heels and performing in this great movie and giving themselves a good time and giving the audience a really terrific movie to enjoy.
Hear, hear. Great answer. I love it. So, Greg, any current or forthcoming commentaries, projects, events, appearances, anything our audience would like to know about?
Let's see. Most recent book I did is a book called a book on the movie Of Mice and Men, the 1939 classic of Mice and Men.
Also starring Lon Chaney Jr.
Also starring Lon Chaney Jr., lots of Chaney Jr. information in there. And it talks about I was very fortunate to get the actual studio records of the making of the movie. So it's basically you almost relive the making of the film by reading the book in that sense, because of the fact that I cover it day by day as to what was being shot and who was working and what was being done and all this sort of stuff. So it got over 100 photos. It is, I hope, a very good tribute to a really outstanding film, one of the 1939's Best Picture nominees.
Yeah, it's often forgotten, but it's a classic. And what is the title of the book, and when will it be out?
And it's simply called Of Mice and Men, and the subtitle is Mental Enfeeblement, Racism, and Mercy Killing in 1939 Hollywood.
Wow, that's a heck of a subtitle.
Yeah, it's a big one. But you can look it up on Amazon under Of Mice and Men.
So available now?
In my name, and it's available now.
Oh, great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that's there. And also are two Hollywood novels, for those people who enjoy Hollywood novels. There's one called Frankenstein's Witch, which largely involves the making of Frankenstein back in 1931.
These are nonfiction, Greg?
These are fiction.
Mm-hmm.
These are fiction books. And another one that recently came out, which is called Platinum Widow, Who Killed Jean Harlow's Husband? So,
oh, wow.
As you know, the Harlow, that particular scandal is probably the most famous unsolved mystery in Hollywood. And so this is a fictional look at it, but it's largely based on nonfiction sources, and mixes a lot of nonfiction into fiction. So those two are two new novels that are out. So they're the two new novels, and there is the Mice and Men book. I'm trying to stay busy.
Oh, you are. Boy, you got a lot on your plate there, and a lot of fun stuff to look forward to if you're a fan of Greg Menken. You should be, folks, because he's a great writer, and you are an extraordinary historian, and I've always enjoyed talking to you and listening to you on various commentaries as well as documentaries, making of things of that nature. And boy, you knocked it out of the park once again, Greg. We so appreciate you making a return trip to Cineversary. Happy Halloween season.
Happy Halloween to you, Eric, and thank you. I'll be happy to talk with you anytime, so just stay in touch.
I'll keep you in mind, sir, because there's always an anniversary coming up for classic horror films, so I'll keep you on speed dial.
Excellent. All right.
Okay, Greg. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
What a great guy that Greg is. So much fun to converse with, and I always learn a lot about the classic horror films I so adore after speaking with him. So I gotta have him back on Cineversary sometime soon, rest assured. Did you know that Cineversary has its own website? That's right, we actually now have a vanity URL that's easy to remember, which will take you to a freshly designed portal where you can quickly access the latest episode of your favorite podcast, as well as all of our previous installments. Now it's a lot easier to spread the good word about our show to your friends and family. You simply tell them to visit Cineversary.com. Pretty simple, right? That's Cineversary.com. We also have a custom email address just for you. Now, if you ever want to share feedback on our show or offer suggestions for future installments, or maybe you just have a question about Cineversary, send it to us at cineversarypodcast@gmail.com. Also, you can really help our show grow by spreading the good word about the Cineversary show to your peeps. Even better, please leave a positive online review and rating, which significantly helps us to get discovered by new listeners. So if you use Apple Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, some of these other services, simply search for the Cineversary page, look for a link that says something like ratings or reviews, click that link, and leave a review and or rating. While you're at it, take a moment to like us on Facebook. We also have a presence on Twitter. Our handle is @CineversaryPod, where you can easily tweet or follow us. And if you want to go an extra step in your support of our show and help keep us ad-free, please consider making a monetary donation to the Cineversary podcast by visiting tinyurl.com/donate-cineversary. We really appreciate your support. Lastly, have you checked out my Cineverse group website? Yeah, it's easy to get confused by these similar sounding names, Cineversary, Cineverse, Tomato. But Cineverse is actually the name of my private film discussion group I founded back in 2005 that continues to meet weekly on Zoom. Every week, the Cineverse group watches, researches, and discusses a different movie, and I create a summary write-up, call it a mini essay if you will, on that movie that gets posted to the Cineverse Group blog. So if you want to enjoy reading in-depth content that examines different discussion-worthy motion pictures, including classic Hollywood films, independent features, foreign masterworks, modern movies, and silent-era standouts, then visit cineversegroup.com, simply spelled CINEVERSE group.com. Fun fact, every posted article on cineversegroup.com includes a link to a recording of our group discussion of that particular film, with me leading the conversation as moderator. So if you like what I'm doing on the Cineversary podcast, you might also want to give a listen to some of our Cineverse Group recordings, which are podcasts of a different sort. Again, head over to cineversegroup.com, where you can check out some interesting text and audio content on a variety of films, not necessarily celebrating a milestone anniversary. What's up next on Cineversary? For November, we look to the East, to be specific, Japan, where a magnum opus was crafted back in 1953, one that currently ranks number 4 on the BFI's Sight and Sound poll of the greatest films ever made. Next month, we spotlight Yasujiro Ozu's Tokyo Story, which enjoys a 70th birthday this year. Until that time, this is your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies, because they're not getting older, they're getting better. Thanks for giving us a listen, and happy Halloween!